Intersection Magazine Podcast. Welcome to Intersection Magazine Podcast. This week I'll be covering a piece that was aired on BBC Daily with Maddie Savage, in which she was asking the question, why has Finland become a hub for defense tech? Once again, I'm your host, Nicholas Gyanda, and this is Intersection Magazine Podcast. Now, those of you who've been following our podcast will realize that in the series in which we have been covering podcasts by the BBC featuring or talking about startups in the world in general, we already had an episode where we covered Finland, although that was talking about Finland's role in the ecosystem in Europe, and Finland being, in a sense, a startup capital on its own with its large infrastructure projects that had already been established. This episode, although, is focusing in on one part or one aspect of technology then, which is defense tech. Now, if you want to understand what defense tech is about, you basically just need to understand that countries have the right to defend and protect themselves. Now, in terms of where this story comes in, or why interest in Finland in particular has increased, is one, because of Ukraine. So those who were in the area and those who studied the effects of Russia's engagement with Ukraine will tell you that there was an interest, or a spike in interest in defense technology post 2022. In fact, in later conversations in which Maddie Savage interviews one of the key players in the sector, an American who is in defense and into the VC space, says that before 2022 and the invasion, Europe was more focused on defense, not on defense, rather on environmental programs and democracy and issues of that nature. But there was a marked shift after the invasion. Now, of course, the other thing that worries the Finns is because they're right next door to Russia and have been invaded before, as was the case in the Second World War. So all these factors are contributing to Finland's interest on the development of the defense tech sector. So in terms of components of defense tech, you've got surveillance tools, military tools, maritime software, and flight simulators. Now, one of the cities in which Maddie Savage of the BBC Daily describes as having a rapid growth in this industry is Helsinki, which, as I said before, especially for Finland, has, as a result of the Ukrainian war. So she describes a situation, for example, where she tests a headset that allowed her to be literally flying over South Africa in a fighter jet. So the company that's in charge of these kinds of innovations refers to this as mixed reality simulators, simulator mixed reality, and it's pretty much virtual reality kind of plus real world content. So the advantage of a system of this kind is standard simulator models are very large, many screens, and are normally housed in massive hangars. They're usually very costly. So this company in Finland has set up a system that can allow you to use the mixed reality headsets, and it's only not only is it useful for military research and all sorts of other things, you can use it for car makers as well as for medical research. So there's been a growth since 2022 of over 50 million USD. And all of this growth has been around the idea of increased insecurity, movement or the decision of Finland to join NATO. In terms of the market, normally what happens for weaponry is the main client is in the US, who ends up sending their weapons to NATO. So what this company does is support what they call synthetic training programs, which means you get to test all sorts of fighter jets or that are compatible with your systems, either before or after buying them, and this reduces the costs. So the company described about maybe 80 synthetic training programs. Another of the factors that has caused an increase in the defense tech investment is the return of Trump into the White House. The deal room says there's been about a 30% increase in VC funds in defense tech startups, where defense tech in this case means defense, security, and resilience. Now, while globally there was kind of like a decrease in funding, Finland was experiencing a growth in about 200 million USD, or for a sector that we described before wasn't always didn't always have a great image. So that brings us back to the person we mentioned before briefly, which is a person called Nicholas Nelson. He put together an article titled "The Opportunity to Build Defense Unicorns," and he said he faced quite a lot of backlash because of what he was saying and the focus that Europeans in general had on environment as opposed to defense and security. So his argument is pretty much that you have human rights to defend, you've got free and fair elections to defend, you have the rights of minorities to defend, and you also have to defend against misinformation and disinformation, and of course direct attacks. So that's pretty much the scope of defense tech. So not only are you dealing with physical threats, but you're also dealing with cyber threats, and also threats, I think that will fall under cyber threats regarding information and disinformation. So Mr. Nelson, who's currently based in the UK, talks about how he faced, as I mentioned, quite a lot of backlash when he mentioned or when he wrote this piece. But after 2022, he describes a sea change where, for example, Finland has about 368 defense tech companies, with 40%, covering about 40% of the companies being in the defense tech space, and growing at a rate of between 30 and 40%. This is quite remarkable, considering the country has a population of about 5 million. Now, if you talk about the region, the Nordic region, you're talking about 85% of investment that has been directed towards this particular sector. The other thing that the author mentioned was the idea that the closer you are to a threat, the more it will seem apparent. And so the investment in this particular area makes sense for Finland, given its proximity to Russia, given its recent engagement with NATO, and of course its fears, its historical fears. This is probably why the people or the entrepreneurs in the ecosystem decided to create around defense. So I really like the the definition that Maddie Savage of the BBC uses when she describes an ecosystem, she described it as people, initiatives, and culture. So the people part of the ecosystem is what fueled the desire to create around defense, having seen all the changes that were taking place in the country and all the finances that were being directed. Now, in terms of the skill base that existed in Finland, you had people that had worked for Nokia and also people that had worked in Microsoft who had the skills and the technical know-how to pivot into other sectors, which helped Finland get a leg up. The other thing that she mentioned was the multitude of spin-out companies, and spin-out companies in her definition are companies that emerge from education institutions and research. This plays also into the idea that businesses really engage with private enterprise in creating private-public partnerships, as well as major events such as Slash, which she mentioned. It's a global, one of the largest events in Europe, as well as a government organization called Business Finland, which has a branch which they call Defense and Digital Resilience. It existed before 2024, but has had a stronger focus in terms of its of the defense tech aspect. So they're able to invest about 120 million euros into small and medium enterprises as well as startups, but are of course much more keen to create a sense of support to watch where these funds are going. Now, also interesting in terms of the defense tech and the global trend around the environment and protection of the environment and sustainability, is that the defense tech sector in Finland has also began to think and to create around sustainability. So there's been a merger of interests, so to speak, which is quite positive. You often find that sometimes the area of military defense is in conflict with environmental concerns. Now, one of the other things that the Finns have tried to do is attract talent. Naturally, they've been in competition with Cambridge for the UK and Munich for Germany. And perhaps the disadvantage that Finland has is its cold winters. So they've been pushing that for quite a while now. One of the criticisms, I suppose, that the Finns have faced is when you talk about how defense tech works versus how startups work. Many people think about this phrase, failing fast. You fail, but you keep building until you succeed. Now, when you're in an ecosystem that's primarily funded by government, and not just government, but taxpayers' money, you don't have the luxury of failing and building and failing and building. So that's been a bit of a hindrance for those who are in the startup space. So the first is really a mentality. The second has to do with maybe you can call it a timeline factor, because startups normally are funded, especially when you go into venture capital and angel investment. The people who fund startups or who invest in startups usually do so for 2 to 5 year periods, maybe maximum 10-year periods. But really for a defense tech, you're talking about 6 to 10 years of concept experimentation to prototyping. And so the timelines are in conflict on the way startups work versus the way defense tech works. So not only is there an issue in terms of funding, one being from taxpayers who really want projects to succeed, there's also the challenge that has to do with timelines. So naturally, not only does that affect startups, it also affects the funding mechanisms that exist in traditional VC and angel spaces. So those are probably some of the areas that can use a lot of work. What Europe has done is increase investment, encourage cooperation between countries in Europe, as well as work on a simpler regulatory environment, so decreasing the bureaucracy that was mentioned exists in Finland. That brings about some of the complex timelines that exist. So that's really a summary of what BBC covered when they were talking about Finland as a defense tech giant, so to speak. And not only is there potential to merge the Finland DefenceTech story with the major Finland story that we covered before, of how Finland was becoming a hub for the ecosystem in Europe and its potential. Because we already talked about Argentina and how Argentina, for example, was focusing on bioengineering and agriculture. So I see similarities between these two ecosystems. On one hand, Finland building big, focusing on Maria 01, for example, as a hub, uniting companies with space and services, but also having a niche area related to an advantage that the country already has, on challenges that the country already faces, with dealing with defense and building around defense and profiting from that work around defense. Argentina, on the other hand, already a supplier in agrochemicals, decides or starts to leverage the advantage that it has in soy and other produce to accumulate the number of patents and to benefit from the profit that exists with having all those patents, increasing the value of their companies and their holdings. So that's two major takeaways from about three different systems or ecosystems in two different countries that I think are worth taking note of. Would love to hear your thoughts about this. Those of you who are into the area or into that sector or are covering the area. Once again, I've been your host, Nicholas Kianda, for Intersection Magazine podcast. Intersection.
Intersection Magazine podcast.